我们继续跟韩国延世大学的教授，也是南韩总统国家安全特别顾问文正仁教授继续来做访谈。President Moon, I'm going to ask you about the relation between South Korea and United States, especially that President Trump seemed to be putting a lot of pressure on trade, especially he mentioned threatening to abolish the free trade agreement with South Korea, and also Seoul is feeling being unfairly treated in the cost sharing deal with the U.S. forces in Korea. How do you describe the U.S. relations with Seoul right now? Is South Korea feeling unfairly treated, or is not being valued as an ally in this sense?
Well, I think the United States still values South Korea as an ally. I have no doubt on that one. Mm-hmm. But on trade issue, we are in better position because we went through the amendment of existing FTA with the United States.
Right.
Therefore, there are no huge pressures from the United States on trade issue. Now, only one issue. The United States wanted to remove South Korea from the status of developing countries in the agricultural sector. And our government has decided to accept American demand.
Right. I heard the news this morning that you're going to leave the developing nation status voluntarily, right?
Yeah, but there was such a pressure, not only from the United States, but also from other developed countries. And as the defense cost sharing, there is a major issue. We used to pay about $900 million, up until 2 years ago. And last year we had renegotiation on defense cost sharing, and we increased it almost $1 billion. Now it is reported that the United States is demanding the increase from $1 billion to $5 billion. As our defense cost sharing with the United States. But our government position is let us sit and talk together and then figure it out. And now negotiation is going on in Hanoi. I don't know what will happen, but it will be extremely difficult for South Korea to accept the $5 billion in a demand, because then that will include even salaries for American soldiers stationed in South Korea. That is why it will be tough negotiation, but one thing is very clear: we are not free riders, and plus, now we have the largest American overseas military base in South Korea. U.S. is not paying any single penny for that one, and we didn't include that cost into the actual defense cost sharing. But in case of Japan, those land, the military base rental cost is included in their defense cost sharing. Therefore, we have been, paying fair share of defense cost. But the President Trump has been arguing that South Korea has been free rider. But let us wait and see what will happen in Honolulu. It will be ongoing negotiation process.
It seems that that President Trump is very different from the previous administration. I mean, in the old days, Seoul was considered a very trusted and reliable ally in this sense. So a lot of things when you are facing with the security consideration will have a favorable treatment for the Seoul. But now it seems to be President Trump is asking not to be a free rider, and then demanding a lot of things, even on some of its trusted allies. South Korea is one, NATO is the other, and then this seems to be a concern for a lot of traditional allies of the United States. Do you think that the U.S. has somewhat deviated from its traditional policy in this sense?
Yes, if you look at President Trump's foreign policy, it is framed around unilateralism, protectionism, and transactionalism. All these three features of President Trump's foreign policy are very different from past behavior. In the past, for example, Obama, he was emphasizing multilateralism, but President Trump emphasizing unilateralism. President Obama and even previous president were emphasizing the importance of free trade. Okay, yes, fair trade is important, but within the framework of fair trade. But in the case of President Trump, okay, he's arguing fair trade ahead of free trade. Therefore, fair trade at the expense of free trade. Okay, then that becomes protectionism. Therefore, there is a concern that the U.S. may be returning to 1930s as a result of the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1931. Then that was the beginning of trade war. The tariff wars between Europe and United States. Third one, transactionalism. Everything is for economic exchange. There is no social exchange, and tit for tat. Okay, and America also wanted to get more gains. Okay, no loses, and that makes foreign relation more difficult. Therefore, all those behaviors are very different from the past American foreign policy. Therefore, now allies and friends are having hard time in adjusting themselves to the new foreign policy direction under President Trump.
There's another side issue regarding the U.S. and South Korean alliance is the deployment of THAAD that create some tension between Seoul and Beijing. Now there's a plan by the United States try to deploy some of the intermediate ballistic missiles to the countries like Australia or perhaps Japan or even South Korea, which is targeting China. Do you think that would create new tension? I know it's pretty early stage of discussion right now, but what would the Seoul attitude toward this?
The American government has not formally raised that issue.
Not yet, okay.
Not yet.
Right.
And also, our defense minister was questioned by reporters on that issue.
Right.
Our defense minister, Chung, made it very clearly that we do not have any plan to allow the deployment of intermediate range ballistic missile. Okay. Therefore, our government has been saying no to the deployment of intermediate range ballistic missile in the South Korean soil.
That's the current position of this.
Yes, that is our current position. Our position is different from Japan.
And also understand that China have been also raising this concern to South Korea as well during the bilateral talks. And what is Seoul's reaction to this?
Yeah, of course, some Chinese commentators have been arguing that if South Korea allows deployment of American intermediate range ballistic missile in South Korea, then South Korea will be Chinese enemy. And we do not want hostile relations with China. Why should we have a hostile relations with China? Therefore, it is extremely unlikely for South Korea to accommodate the deployment of American intermediate range ballistic missiles. No.
For the past few months, there seemed to be a tension between Seoul and Tokyo. It started from a historical issue and it's proliferated into trade and even to security. Now, the South Korean Prime Minister had been visiting Tokyo and then have a meeting with the Japan Prime Minister. Do you think that the tension will gradually ease because of this, or do you expect that it's going to continue?
I don't know. And apparently, according to Japanese newspapers, Prime Minister Abe has been very, very categorically rejecting, our proposal because they argues that the Prime Minister is reportedly argued that South Korea should comply with 1965 claims settlement period. No more compromise. But then we have legal issues in South Korea because our Supreme Court made a verdict saying that the 1965 claims settlement accord had some flaws. Therefore, the Supreme Court verdict supplemented that flaws. Then here, big issue is this. Prime Minister Abe is championing the primacy of state. When there is agreement between state and state, and then state should be responsible for that agreement. But our government position, and President Moon Jae-in was a human rights lawyer, and his position is this: state cannot represent individual victims' right without their consent and their participation. Therefore, any interstate agreement without participation of victims and their consent cannot be valid. Okay. Therefore, 1965 Claims Settlement Accord abrogate our government's right to protect the victims diplomatically, but the victims have their own individual right to make litigation.
Right.
That is what happened.
Right.
Therefore, hold this issue between the so-called plaintiffs, South Korean plaintiffs, and the dependents, Mitsubishi Heavy Machinery and New Nippon Steel. There is a civil case. Therefore, there is no room for the government to intervene. Okay? Therefore, unless a special law is enacted in the National Assembly, our government cannot intervene in. But Japan is just ignoring. And there is another big issue. In the case of Japan, U.S., United Kingdom, they have so-called a diplomatic practice called the amicus curiae. Amicus curiae means friends of the court. If there is any differences between judiciary branch and executive branch, then judiciary branch is obliged to consult with foreign ministry before they make a verdict when there is a conflict between international law and domestic law. But South Korea does not have that kinds of legal clause. Okay? Therefore, if foreign ministry tries to influence judiciary branch, it becomes illegal. And therefore, I hope, first of all, I do not want any kinds of further deterioration of Japan-South Korea relations. Then both sides need to have some kinds of intersubjective understanding, okay, so that they can come up with a much more mutually acceptable compromise.
There is some talks about asking the Washington to come in to mediate the tension between Tokyo and Seoul. But so far, is the Washington reluctant to do it, or the Washington cannot intervene in this kind of affairs?
But as to the forced labor workers issue, there's no room for U.S. to intervene.
Right.
Okay? But in the case of comfort women, the Obama administration intervened, and then ROK and Japan signed, they had some kind of informal accord. But in the case of forced labor workers, it would be extremely difficult for the U.S. to make an intervention. Then with the issue of so-called export, the control of strategic, the export control of strategic, materials, and then non-renewal of GSOMIA. Okay, maybe under those issues, U.S. can intervene, but the Trump administration did not intervene. Okay.
From the Korean perspective, do you think that the U.S. is actually sided with Japan in this sense?
There are a lot of South Koreans feel that the U.S. sided with Japan.
You just mentioned about that China is going to play a more active role in both mediating Korea and Japan, and also people are saying that it's possible for China to play a greater role in Asia, even competing with the United States in that sense, since China is already rising. Do you find that Korea is somewhat caught in between those two big powers, and especially that Korea would have to choose side between them?
Yeah, there are internal debates in South Korea, and a lot of conservatives argue that we should pursue pro-American balancing strategy.
Right.
Take side with the United States and cope with Chinese rise. And that is traditional conservative view. And there's some progressive people in South Korea argue that we should learn from the lesson from the past history, like a transition period between Hu Jin, Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty, which wrongly took side with the Ming Dynasty, and we suffered a lot.
Right.
And therefore, some historians argue that it is better for us to bandwagon China, okay, rather than taking side with the declining hegemon United States.
There are several movies about this. The metaphor is that the China will be the rising Qing, and the American will be the declining Ming.
Yeah, those historians argue in that way. And third is we have some nationalists who argue that we should stand alone.
Okay.
Neither China nor the United States. We should develop nuclear weapons, and we should project ourselves as a middle power. And another view is very much opportunistic approach. Okay, why can't we go along with China and the U.S. On economic relations with China, security relations with the United States? Then we should pursue mother-through diplomacy.
Mother-through.
But another one, and that is really echoed by President Kim Dae-jung, President Roh Moo-hyun, even now President Moon Jae-in. Yes, our U.S. alliance is very, very important for us, at least in the short run. But in the medium to long run, we should go beyond the paradigm of alliance. Because alliance requires us to share common enemies and common threat. Then we cannot get away from the perpetual security dilemma. Therefore, at one point, we should make the paradigmatic shift from the collective defense system based on alliance to a collective security system through the multilateral cooperation regime. And particularly President Roh Moo-hyun was a strong advocate of that approach. Particularly if North Korean nuclear issue is resolved and inter-Korean relations get better, then it will be very difficult to justify continuing alliance relations with the United States. And then we may come up with a new security architecture. Okay. I personally support the new security architecture approach. Therefore, in the short run, there is no choice but to rely on the United States, okay, because we have, a clear and present threat coming from North Korea. But in the medium to longer term, there got to be transformation of security architecture in Northeast Asia.
I'm going to ask you the final but difficult question is, this arguments that is going to face, it seems to be a dilemma for a lot of Asian countries. When you talk about Korea seeing there's two powers here in Asia, you have to making decisions, and also for Taiwan. As you know, that Taiwan and China had its special relationship, cross-strait. We have the civil war, internal conflict going on. But on the other hand, we have to rely on the U.S. for providing security. But now more and more Taiwan economy is relying on China. But China is posing a threat to Taiwan. So what would be your suggestion for the Taiwan situation?
But in your case, your case is somewhat different from South Korean case.
Right.
We are so-called full-fledged sovereign state.
Right.
In your case, is somewhat dubious status. And one way it may be muddling through, but muddling through is not easy. But I would, to some extent, under President Ma Ying-jeou, you went through the muddling through process. But now you have a new leader. New leader has a very distinctive independent policy. But I don't know. But the Taiwanese people should decide, okay, which way to go. But one thing is very clear. Okay, today's China is different from China in 1994-95, in a missile crisis period. Therefore, in other words, maybe U.S. may not be able to protect China as Chinese people want. Okay? Therefore, you should come up with a diplomatic ingenuity to avoid any kinds of collision and try to come up with good relations with mainland China as well as the United States.
Thank you very much, Professor Moon, for sharing your thoughts on the situation in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
谢谢您的收看，我们下次见。